So, this lecture is about the affluent society that emerges in the United States between 1950 and 1960, because the post-World War II economic boom is really going to put the United States in a great spot in a social and economic way. So, even though this is the era of the Cold War and people are terrified about nukes and really paranoid about Russian infiltration and the Soviets and communism and all of this stuff, it's actually a really great time for the United States, especially if you're kind of a middle class white society. It's considered the golden age of the United States and also sometimes called the American zenith. So we're going to look at zenith being kind of the peak or the top of something. And we're going to look at it because this era of the 1950s is really is considered a very affluent society. A lot of consumer products, things like toasters and new things for housewives and all sorts of gizmos and gadgets that their average American can now afford. So we're going to look at a little bit economically why this is considered the golden age. Why are the 1950s, specifically 1950 to 1960, why is this considered such an economic golden age? Well, because the United States was doing great. They were extremely productive. There were a lot of jobs, and part of the reason why that was the case, why economically it's a golden age, is because you could see in 1950, obviously, there is a huge growth in American productivity. But the reason that's the case is because you remember during World War II, the United States really did something amazing and in a very short amount of time managed to turn almost every factory into a very productive, efficient war machine, turning everything, things that made cars were making jeeps and tanks, and clothing factories were making uniforms. They really retooled them really well, and they also did a fantastic job of making tons more factories. So the United States comes off of World War II incredibly well kitted out factory wise. They're really got lots and lots of places to make and manufacture stuff. And they're doing well after World War II because the United States was never bombed. It was never attacked on the mainland. Yeah, there was Pearl Harbor, but that didn't affect productivity. That didn't affect people's daily lives, really. There wasn't like Germany that was absolutely flattened and all their factories turned to rubble, or Japan that was flattened as well, and then under Allied occupation. The United States is the champion of the Second World War, along with the Soviet Union. And their factories are in pristine shape, and they've got a ton of them. And Roosevelt's administration and later the Truman administration was really concerned about post-war employment. They didn't want all of a sudden now there's less jobs because there's no war demand. They wanted to make sure that that was not going to happen. So what happens is all of those factories that retooled for the war effort are put to use making luxury goods. They're sent back to making cars and clothing and all sorts of other stuff. All of these existing factories start producing stuff like toasters and vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators, and it keeps a lot of people in work. It gives a lot of people jobs. And it makes it so that Americans can afford these things because if you have mass-produced vacuum cleaners, they're cheaper and the average American on a regular salary can afford to buy a vacuum cleaner. It's no longer a product only for the rich or for someone who has hired help or a maid who's going to use that vacuum cleaner. Anybody can buy it. So the 50s see this incredible an economic golden age because there is not a post-war slump. There's people are put to work in fixing factories back to peacetime demands, and those factories start producing tons and tons of stuff. Everything from World War II is just keeps on going. They don't end their productivity. And the federal government finances a lot of it too. They really the president and his men, those folks don't want to see joblessness. They don't want to see economic issues. So the government makes sure that even if there are some factories struggling, they're going to help them along to make sure that the jobs stay going. And another thing that really makes this a golden age is it's not just um, the economics and everybody's working and factories are heavily productive. There's also a lot of improvement to technology in this era that keeps facilitating all of this economic growth and this economic boom because the government is really pouring lots and lots of money into technological advancements, which creates lots of jobs because you need people to create these things and to do the research. And the reason the government is so motivated to innovate, to fund scientific research and progress, is because they want to keep up with the Soviets. They're terrified of being outpaced scientifically by the Soviet Union. They don't want them to get ahead with better weapons and better observational materials or anything at all, really. So the government pours lots of money into the advancements to aircrafts, missiles, things like radar, satellites, space travel. They're trying for that too. The era of the early kind of science fiction-y looking things that they make. But they really want to make sure that they're keeping up with the Soviets. So this also provides lots of jobs and lots of opportunities for people to work in a aircraft factory or to be an aerospace engineer or researcher. And it's really kicked off even stronger this era of innovation and scientific advancement during the 50s part of the Cold War, because in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which is the first orbital satellite. And that really terrifies the United States because the Soviets beat them to space. It kicks off this space race where everybody wants to be the first to the moon or the first to have the next big innovation in space. They want to be the ones to to get ahead. So that leads to a lot of innovation in aerospace and just space engineering too. Because now you have a space race, all of a sudden that's a hot career. You're going to get a well-paying job if you're into aeronautics or you know a lot of engineering skills. So things are changing a lot in the 1950s too. The United States sees a lot of change. You've got economic booming growth, lots of jobs, very low unemployment, extremely low unemployment. Also, a lot of technical innovation, but you also see a difference in the way that people are living. Another big change of the era is suburbanization, where people are living outside of urban areas. And this is just a general, I stole this picture from the internet. This is just a general thing about um, kind of the different divides of living. You could either live in a rural area, which is kind of around here where there's more farms and larger acreage and people are kind of far apart. And then you have suburban, which is a little bit more, it's separate homes usually, but they're on smaller lots and a lot closer together. And then you have urban living, which is city living. It's apartment buildings, it's New York City, it's like Manhattan. And for a really long time, the only really two places you could live was urban or rural. It kind of cities just stopped, and then there was rural society right outside of them. And there really was no such thing as suburban, where you were kind of in the middle of a big urban city or rural life. And the reason that these suburban living spaces, these single family homes, detached, usually on maybe quarter of an acre, half acre, maybe, sometimes even smaller. The reason that these start to emerge during the 1950s is because partially there is a lot of low interest loans that the government funds, generally for veterans too. The GI Bill, they give them money to purchase homes. And now that there's a lot of low interest rates, it's cheaper to build or buy a home because you're not going to pay as much interest. There's a spike in demand of people who want to own a home. And to meet that demand, just more homes have to be built. The available space is not in cities. Cities are full. So people start to grow buildings around them and they create this suburban space. It's also helped a lot by the fact that there is a lot of new, fast, and very cheap building techniques that crop up during this time, where it's kind of they're called sometimes like modular homes, those homes that are basically like catalog order homes where they're all just very cookie cutter and they're able to be put up really quickly because they're all prefabricated. These prefabricated homes are pretty fast and cheap and they meet the demand for all of these returning veterans that want their own home and can afford it, and people that are just they're doing well. They're affluent because they have a good factory job that pays well and can you can buy an affordable home. So people want them. The other thing that's really, we're going to talk about things that help grow the suburbs. Another thing, of course, is going to be vehicles because more people can afford those too. So you can actually afford to drive somewhere. Whereas a lot of the reason most people lived in the city is because they worked there and they didn't have any other way to get to their job than to walk because they couldn't afford a car, so they just had to live in the city. You only really had a car if you lived in a rural area and maybe you had to drive it around the farm or something, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But car ownership starts to go up, and that helps fund this, helps grow suburbanization as well. Talking about prefabricated homes and the growth of homes, it's the late 1940s through 1950s that sees the growth of places called Levitt towns. And Levitt towns are the housing developments. The very first one was created by the Levitt brothers on Long Island, William and Alfred Levitt. They created this. The first one was in 1947 and a couple more between 1950, and they really just kind of boom in the 50s. And the Levitt towns are just mass-produced towns where they pop up basically almost overnight. You just have builders come in, they crank out these identical homes that are all prefabricated. It takes like a day to build one of these because once you've got the groundwork laid and the concrete poured and everything, you can just, like a Lincoln Logs, you just put it together like Legos. It clicks together like a little wooden building kit and boom, a home. And people love it. They really want to live there. There's a lot of detractors who think this is disgusting, and they don't want to live in such conformity. But a lot of people they think it's wonderful. Their parents had no opportunity to own their own home ever, and now their children have the ability to own the ground under their feet, own their own home, completely be detached from an apartment. It's considered quite the luxury for some people. This is a step up in life. But the Levitt towns are named after the Levitt brothers that start this, where they have these very affordable homes. They build them up. A lot of Lev some There is a couple Levitt towns. There's Levittown, Long Island, which was the first one, and I think there's a Levittown, Pennsylvania. They built another one. But any real like prefab housing community in the 50s gets the nickname Levittown because it's considered a little bit of a dig at it, like, oh, you live in a Levittown. Okay. Um, and there's this kind of mixed opinions about the quality of life in a Levittown. Some people think it's great, but others are like, ugh, look at all this. That looks pretty dismal. The first Levittown was about 10,000 houses and 40,000 people, which is not a bad number. That's a little city in and of itself. And the thing with the Levittowns is that they are very indicative of a lot of things of the suburbs that they have, where it's definitely suburban. It's designed to house people that work in the city but don't live there. So these new housing developments, you need a car if you're going to get to work. What if you notice about this picture here, what do you see? Nothing but homes. If you live here, like right in the middle, this little tiny house right there on the corner, how are you getting to work? Where even is your work? It's miles and miles away, probably in the nearest city, probably at an aircraft manufacturing plant. If you're getting there, you better have a car because you're certainly not walking, not like in the city. So these suburbs are designed for people who own their own automobile. And a lot of people in the 50s do, because just like everything else being cranked out on an assembly line that was fixed up during World War II, cars are being mass produced and they're much more affordable. The average American can buy their own car, they become ubiquitous. It no longer becomes really a luxury thing or something that's unnecessary. It becomes just par for the course. You need a car, you have a car. It's like owning clothes. You have to have one. But the thing about cars is that something changes a little bit in the 50s where I think partially just because maybe with all that conformity, they'd make some really beautiful cars and they become kind of works of art, statement pieces. So it's not like they're cranking out the same thing on the assembly line. Yeah, they kind of have that 1950s look, but they're really beautiful. They make these gorgeous vehicles that are designed to have character. They've got white wall tires and all different colors. It's not like the early EV automobiles that were all black, or even today where everything seems to be kind of black and gray. It creates this kind of sense of of culture amongst vehicles where they become a fashion statement. You know, you want to have a car that's as nice as your clothing, where you want to have it stand out and be kind of flashy. And people really get into this. Cars become part of a way of life. People go cruising in them. They drive around just to drive them. They go to drive-in movies where you sit in your car and you watch a movie. So it just becomes part of everyday life, part of a real car culture. And helping helping this along, helping encourage vehicle ownership is the fact that in the 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower passes the Interstate Highway Act, 1956. And what it does is it provides lots and lots of money, I think something like over $1 billion eventually, to grow infrastructure in the United States so that people can drive around and to just modernize the country and create more roads and highways. So the interstate system is really built up. It starts to exist in the 1950s because the government is investing in it. Over the course of, I think, about 13 years, they invest several $1 billion into growing the United States interstate highway system. Part of the reason why President Dwight Eisenhower did this, why he has the government fund so many roads, is because people do want to drive around. The cars are getting more ubiquitous, and people want to be able to get from New York to LA or something and take a long road trip, but also because Eisenhower saw this as a sort of national security measure. The whole purpose of the Interstate Highway Act, it's not just a feel-good measure to build up infrastructure and let people drive their cool cars around. A big thing is Eisenhower saw this as a way where if the military ever really needed to get around the whole United States quickly, they could. They could use the interstate system to get from one plot spot to another really fast. You have a military base in Kansas, and the United States is attacked by the Soviets on the East Coast. Think of how much faster the military could get from all of their different bases across the country to wherever the threat was with an existing interstate highway system. So it was for a troop movement as well. And the other thing, kind of a fun fact about the interstate highway system is that if it was designed so that if need be, a lot of the highways were supposed to be straight because in an emergency they could be used as landing strips for airplanes and aircraft, military air vehicles. If you notice the interstate highways, anything you drive around on anything that's an official interstate, there's a lot of straight runs, and that's a reason. I think there's some measurement where it's like every couple miles there has to be this many miles of straight run because in an emergency the interstates can be used as landing strips and landing areas. So they have to be kind of straight and level for a lot of different every sort of interspersed throughout it. So that's why the interstates are so very straight is because of that reason too. And that, again, that's a Cold War innovation that created a lot of jobs, building roads. And um, all of the factories creating all of this consumer stuff was also helping make it so that people could just have more stuff in their house, not just having a car. I talked a little bit about this, making why it's kind of a golden era. A lot of all of this growth helps people be able to afford things like TVs. TVs become much more popular in the 1950s, almost ubiquitous like a car, where you just have one in your house. For a really long time, it's just kind of standard to have a TV, just like now people generally kind of have computers in their homes. But it becomes a lot more normal during this time too to have like a credit card or sort of have a debt, have a tab at the local store because it's for a while freedom and just prosperity was seen as having no debt. You owed nothing to nobody. You were free and clear as a bird, and that was that. But in the 50s, there's so much cool junk around that people want it so badly that that's considered the more desirable thing. You'd rather owe money and pay things off in installments and have the TV than have no debt and no TV. So people want the stuff so badly that they're willing to buy things on installment or on credit. And being, in debt as in, you still owe money on your car, you still owe money on your home, you owe money on all the knickknacks you bought. That's normal. What's not normal is just not having a TV or a car. Everybody is sort of in debt. They owe something. And it's not considered bad. That's a big change too, is it's not a dig against your character. Oh, I'm still paying off my car. So what? So is everybody else. They have mortgages on their homes that they're paying off. They have things they owe. They're not in trouble for it. They just bought it on credit. And I think part of the reason why this is the case is why people found these things so desirable, desirable enough that they're willing to pay them off with interest over time and owe money on their stuff is because television does have, now that this is a new medium that people can afford and have in their homes, they're being bombarded with ads about more stuff and how glamorous being kind of middle class is and making that status desirable. And also just establishing what being middle class is. Like what makes you middle class? Having a TV, a car, a lot of knickknacks like radios and washing machines and all sorts of stuff. So you want it, it makes it desirable, it shows you what there is, and it just feeds into this culture of being middle class as sort of as something that people can aspire to and should aspire to. Sometimes I show some clips about 50 shows. I might put some in for your assignments, but we'll see. But it generally becomes known, like if you're middle class, you live in the suburbs, you're married with several kids, and you've got all sorts of luxury goods, like a TV. And you might still be paying those off. Women's roles change a lot too during the 50s. This is another kind of social change that occurs. Um, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. Depends on who you ask or what your analysis of women's roles are. But women's roles do change. Most women left the workforce after World War II. At least they left. And if they did leave the workforce, they left the jobs they had. Even if they stayed working, they kind of changed jobs in the 50s because you remember some of those other videos about working women. Um, they're like, oh, this job belongs to a soldier in this factory. When he comes back, he can have it because this is a very masculine job and he wants to come back from the war and uh, have a nice, well-paying, like welding job or something. And women are going to leave because that was just an aberration for the duration. We were gonna go back to either not working or having socially acceptable jobs. And so a lot of women left those defense jobs like manufacturing and creating aircraft. And women who did stay in the workforce or were working, a lot of them were part-time positions that were considered pink collar. And a pink collar job is something that doesn't pay very well, and it's often designed to be a very like feminine position, like a secretary, a kindergarten teacher, a stewardess on a plane, um, something like that, a maid. And it was designed to like allow women to make a little money, but it was not supposed to be a breadwinner's salary. Like you couldn't support a whole family on a secretary's salary. It was supposed to kind of supplement a man's income or give the family a little extra cash, maybe to go on a nice vacation that year. Mom's paycheck was not going to be paying off the mortgage. That was going to be dad's paycheck. Um, and it was kind of to help, the money is there to help people maintain a middle class lifestyle and buy vacuums and toasters. It's not a well-paying role. Um, a lot of the middle class women they're just working in these positions that are kind of thought of as women's roles and also just not paying well for the sense that people didn't, why should it pay a salary? Because especially if you're married, your husband is the one that's making all the money at the missile factory. It's not going to be you as a secretary in an office that's working maybe 2 or 3 hours a day, or as a temp or something. One of the things with the 50s is that it's considered so affluent that a lot of women didn't have to work, where a husband's salary could cover everything. You have a man who works a standard work week at a blue collar job, even something like factory work, and that was enough to pay for everything. That was kind of the height of middle class living, was to be prosperous enough in your job, even a blue collar one. You didn't even have to be a lawyer or a doctor. You could be working in a missile factory and working on an assembly line. That everything was so affordable in the 50s that that would be enough to support like a family of five, would be one salary. And it was considered really good to be able to have a good enough job where your wife didn't have to work. That was kind of the hallmark of middle class living was mom could stay home and raise the children and be a housewife. That was her whole job was taking care of that nice suburban home, raising several children, cooking, cleaning, using all these nice labor-saving devices like vacuums here to make her job easier. But that was something a lot of women did aspire to, is to be free of having to work so that they could be a housewife. And a lot of ads and things in the 50s kind of pushed that ideal that housewives would find fulfillment in performing domestic duties, that that was something to aspire to. You know, you get married, you have children, and you become a stay-at-home mother and work in the home. And you had it, and you really should want that because it was considered a pretty cushy gig. You had it better than your mother or grandmother could have even dreamed of. You didn't have to wash clothing by going out to the well and pumping water and scrubbing on a washboard and having doing all this back-breaking work. You had wonderful new innovative things like a washing machine where you just dump the clothing in and go. You had a vacuum. You weren't sweeping like a pilgrim. You're vacuuming your home with a Hoover. So there's a lot of we'll get in the 1960s, there's going to be kind of a backlash against this where women feel a bit constrained by their options, where it's basically work part-time as a secretary or be a housewife. So you'll see a little bit more pushback against this, but it's seen as quite glamorous in the 50s to be a housewife. It's something, you know, why not? It's a nice role to get. And this is highlighted too talking a little bit about those labor-saving devices aimed at women, and how this has kind of changed their lives too. This becomes quite apparent in something known as the kitchen debate in 1959. And what happens in the kitchen debate is kind of a bit of a backstory here. By 1959, there had been something of a political thaw. Like it was a little, the Cold War had gotten a little less cold by 1959. And at that time, the American vice president, he wasn't president yet, was Vice President Richard Nixon, was invited to give an ex sort of host this exposition of American progress in Moscow by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. And that's them right here in the front. Khrushchev is this guy, the kind of with the light suit on, bald head there, and this is Vice President Nixon. So, despite everything, despite how much the US and the Soviets still really hate each other, they're trying to at least smile and wave and not be quite as overtly disgusted by one another. And the Americans set up this big exhibit in Moscow about how great the United States is, basically. It's supposed to really brag and lay on really thick about how materially abundant people in the United States had it. It was supposed to be this big show-off event, really, where the Americans hoped that the Soviets would be just awed and thrilled and just shocked by how fantastic the average working American lived. Like you could work in a steel factory and afford to have a gorgeous kitchen with all of it. Look at all this cool stuff. You've got a washing machine in your kitchen. You've got all this brand new fancy soap, and it's very high end, nice countertops, clean, fancy electricity, blenders, ye old microwave, refrigerator. I don't even know. Think of every kind of fancy kitchen gadget and stand mixer. That's one. Anything you could think of. The United States is like, look at this is what how even the poorest middle class American lives. And even if you can't have this, you work a little bit, you'll get to afford it really quickly. Our people live so well. It was a way to show off the superiority of their political and economic system. And one of the things that happens, kind of this infamous moment, is Nixon and Khrushchev are wandering through the exhibit, and Nixon's like, and this is an average kitchen. Of course, Khrushchev basically says, well, you know, we have kitchens in Russia too. Um, we have electricity too, in case you didn't know. And Nixon really lays it on pretty thick, and he kind of shows off the kitchen and basically says that this is kind of showing that the United States is the winner here because we have designed these epic kitchen appliances that have made an extremely high standard of living for women, and that it was the capitalist system that liberated women from drudgery, from having to slave over a hot stove all day and having to, have a wood fire burning and having to heat their food over a wood stove and scrub dishes and go outside to the creek to get fetch water and all that 1600 style living that I guess they assumed the Russians had too. So it really shows that the luxury of women, the lifestyle of a nation's female population as an example of that nation's superiority. Like whatever country had liberated its women from kitchen work had won. And family structure is also changing too. So we've got like changing roles for women, changing lifestyles, and also just a changing population and a changing family structure. After World War II, so after the end of World War II, about here, 1945-ish, right there. Um, After World War II, and by between World War II and 1960, there is an uptick in population of the United States, huge uptick in births, especially right here. This is when all the soldiers come home. Whoa. So it's called the baby boom because people are having a lot of children. And there's some reasons for this. Obviously, of course, you've got all the soldiers coming home right here for that first wave of the baby boom, but it stays pretty steady up here. The population, the rise in births is pretty steady in the 1950s, more so than the 60s, 70s, and even today. I mean, look at the difference in births here, number of babies born per thousand people. There's a lot more. This is kind of a big high here. And part of the reason why this is happening is because the United States is doing so dang good. They're doing so well. People feel that they can have children because they could afford to have three or four of them. They can feed them, house them, clothe them, send them to school, and buy them lots of shiny knickknacks and junk. So people want to have kids. And you can see by this graph too that every time something good happens, people have a lot of babies. And when things go south, there's less children born because a lot of Americans sit back and think, do I really want to have a child now? Can I afford a child? Do I want to bring kids into this world? We'll see. You can see the 1920s, the roaring 20s, where economics were booming. World War I was over. The United States was doing great. People were buying cars and luxury junk then too. The population is really high. People are having a lot of children in the 20s. Look at the Great Depression. It takes a real nosedive. People don't want to have babies in the Depression when they can hardly afford to eat and don't have jobs. When employment is good and the economy is booming, people have jobs and they feel secure, they have babies. And you can see that in the 1950s. The baby boom is more evidence of how prosperous the 50s were because people felt good enough to have a lot of kids. There was also a lot of stuff going on, kind of other political stuff kicking about how um, there was an encouragement, like you had to keep the population up because you didn't want the Soviets to outpopulate you. So, yeah, people are scared of nuclear warfare, and you'd think maybe that might scare a few people off from having a kid. But no, they were pretty secure so far, so good. Not too many nuclear threats going on, doing all right. And you can't let the Soviets out baby you. You can't let them win the baby war here either and have too many baby booms over there. So have four kids because you can afford it. Politically, there is some other changes too going on in the 50s. So a lot of social change, a lot of social growth, but politically there is some changes as well. And these come about with the classic president of the 1950s is Dwight D. Eisenhower. And there he is. What a grandfatherly, lovely looking man. I mean, how could you not trust Dwight D. Eisenhower? He was a war hero. He was General Eisenhower from World War II. He wins the presidential election because he's just, look at him, had a chest full of medals, helped win the Second World War. I mean, who wouldn't want him in charge? And Eisenhower he's a very popular president, very fatherly, very likable. He had the dumbest campaign slogan. It's not dumb if it works, but it's really inane. It was "I like Ike," because that was his nickname, was Ike. People didn't like calling him Dwight, I guess. I don't know. But he was very popular. He's elected in 1952 on his very likable image, war hero, a fatherly looking guy, smiling, very optimistic, very calm, very nice. Um, and he is part of this big change of the 50s is that it's a little bit more conservative. And he's the first Republican president in 20 years. The Republican Party had not been doing really well in the 30s and 40s because the last Republican to be president was Herbert Hoover, and he wrecked that party because of how unpopular he was. Herbert Hoover was like the devil because everyone blamed him for the Great Depression and for not doing enough and for just being so dour and abysmal that it taints an entire political party for like 2 decades. And the Democratic Party had been enjoying a lot of victories too because of how beloved Franklin Roosevelt was. He's still considered like the best Democrat ever. If you look at like most popular I mean, even most popular presidents, barring political party, FDR still carries that flame. He is just legendary. So the Republicans had a quite the challenge ahead of them in the political sphere because they're followed by the shadow of Herbert Hoover, and they've got enormous shoes to fill in the sense of who can match FDR's popularity? I mean, Mr. won the Great Depression and the war, you really can't beat it. So, but Eisenhower comes along with this very like mature, calm attitude and this, of course, war hero background. And he helps change the Republican Party by trying to rebrand it. He calls it modern republicanism, and he rebrands the party by kind of changing their platform and adopting this modern republicanism idea. The modern Republican idea is to you're still kind of conservative. You don't want too much social change. You kind of like things more traditional, and you don't like a lot of large government organizations or a lot of government spending. That's kind of the hallmarks of conservatism. But modern republicanism adopts the idea that too much pushback against the New Deal, too much being rabid against spending had cost the Republicans their popularity and their power. Eisenhower's modern republicanism adopts the idea that we're not going to be so much against the New Deal because people loved it. There's a reason they loved it, and we should just leave it in place and go with it. For a while, the Republican Party had been rampant about rolling back all of those big spending things that FDR had put in place, like Social Security and all of those other social programs like the CCC and anything, those infrastructure projects. But Eisenhower says people like it, so if we ever want to be in charge again as Republicans, we better just deal with it. So Eisenhower adopts this modern, different approach of simply leaving the welfare system in place that he had inherited. And he said, and I think I'm not sure if it was Eisenhower or someone else, but he has this famous quote where he says, "Any president that attacks Social Security is not going to be in office very long." And he realizes that even if he kind of disagreed with the government giving away money and spending a lot on social projects, you have to sort of pick your battles. So the new Republican Party with Eisenhower is a little bit more liberal than any Republicans in the past. They're kind of a middle ground here, a middle ground party. They're not quite as conservative as they had been. They're a little more willing to spend the money. And so it seems like the 1950s are pretty like conformed. There's like a consensus. Everybody seems pretty happy. They got homes now. They have good jobs. A president who is kind of a, happy grandfatherly type in office. But there's plenty of critics here. And we'll get more into the criticisms as we talk about the civil rights movement and the 1960s and all sorts of other stuff going on. But there's plenty of things going on where people are not everybody's happy in the 50s. Of course, yes, they're scared of the Cold War and scared of being nuked, but there's also social critics too. Um, the women that we'll talk about women's issues as well when we get to the 60s that grows out of the unhappiness of the fifth, some of the unhappiness that they had in the 50s. But there is some critics, a lot of younger people that are born like during the baby boom and they kind of reach their teen years in the 1950s are quite unhappy with the life they're growing up in. And one of the groups here is known as the Beats. And the Beats were kind of people who were about in their teens in the 1950s that felt that life just really wasn't very satisfying, that there wasn't a lot for them out there. They felt that mainstream culture was super bland and just absolutely stifling. They called themselves the Beats because they had this like beat poetry thing going where they liked this obscure form of poetry that they felt was different and cool and hip and edgy and whatnot. And it kind of set them aside. And they get called beatniks because it's kind of a dig against them. Supposedly they get that term because they like the beat poetry and they like a cool beat, hip hop beat. Aw, I'm so cool. And they add the critics add the nick to the end because Sputnik, that's a like a Russian thing. So they're kind of digging at these young people like they're Soviet sympathizers in a way, or at least that they're kind of the enemy because they are like the Soviets. If they don't like American culture, if you're ragging on us, that's uncool, man. You shouldn't do that. You should kind of conform in the 50s because if we don't have everybody moving together in lockstep, then the Soviets have divided us. You can't have critics in a society that's trying to be better than everybody because if we have critics, people might think we're not so good. So there's a lot of hate for unhappy teenagers in the 50s. You don't want to show a divided front here at home in the middle of the Cold War. We have vacuum cleaners, we should be very happy, and everybody better get in line. But people like teenagers are really, they're trying to kind of set themselves aside and create their own culture. And a lot of them felt too that they're growing up in the suburbs, that it's very empty. They have what's their future? They're going to grow up in a Levittown home and work in a missile factory like dad. It's very monotonous, very unfulfilling, very bland, very consumerist, where everybody is just so interested in making money and buying vacuums that there's no soul in it. There's no spiritual fulfillment. Like it's just nothing. It's just this boring, empty, vacuous, awful existence. And a lot of them try to turn to new ways of expressing themselves. This is when sort of drug culture, the like 1950s, 60s take off. But you also have adoption of Eastern religions. This is why the 50s thinks that like Buddhism is so cool because it was considered the offbeat religion, like it was something different. But you also have a lot of trouble where kids who feel very unfulfilled with no future and just kind of adrift start to turn to delinquency and they get in a lot of trouble. And there is this kind of, like if life is all about just making money to buy vacuum cleaners, then what's the point? There is this huge, more than ever in the past, this is another big change of the 50s, this huge concern that it's the young population that needs more guidance, that they're kind of setting themselves up as um their own like social group more so than in the past. Whereas throughout history, you had like there was kids and then there was adults. And now all of a sudden you have this teenagers because they can be. Because if dad is working and preparing and dad is working and providing for everybody, you can be a kid for a little bit longer. You don't immediately have to go work in the mines the second you're able to, or get a job right out of high school. You can go to college, you can kind of hang around a little bit and figure out what you want to do because your parents can still support you for a little longer. So you have this new section of the population where you have young people that have their own culture and they start to get in a lot of trouble. And there is this surge of concern about juvenile delinquency. And a lot of grown Americans, adults in the 50s, are very concerned with this because for them, they can't figure out why the kids are so unhappy. A lot of Americans had grown up, if you're an adult in the 50s, you probably lived through the Great Depression and World War II, and you were like, thank God, the only thing we have to worry about right now is maybe a nuclear weapon. I'm not jobless, starving, or getting shot at in Germany. I am happy in my boring little home with my boring little life. Boring is good. I am thrilled. I am prosperous. I am doing the best I ever have. Why is my son being such a little jerk? When you grow up in prosperity, you don't really appreciate peace as much as perhaps you should. And that's the real just generational divide that emerges in the 50s is that the kids and adults have this real clash of values where kids want adventure and action and meaning in their life. And adults are just like, you have it good, just calm down. So it's just such a clash between the two that kids act out even more, it seems. Not all the time. I mean, kids are pretty good in the 50s too, but it stands out more. People are more concerned about it. And a big concern Americans had was that, oh no, if our kids are acting out and it's on the news, juvenile delinquency, there's kids robbing stores and beating each other up in the streets and joining gangs and doing all sorts of bad things. The Russians are going to see this. They're going to see the cracks in the armor at home and the conformity. They're going to think that American life is bad and we're going to lose support and it's all very, very scary. So they wanted to show a strong home front, a strong, united America, with happy kids and happy everything. So they're just grown-ups are just pulling their hair out about juvenile delinquency, and it gets there's a lot of popular movies that highlight not just the alienation teenagers felt, but also just the concern adults had with it. And a lot of grown-ups look for the reason behind this, like what's going on with the kids. And a lot of them felt that it was the some of the new cultural things that were changing kids because they can't imagine that it's prosperity that's doing this, that's making kids feel like there's no purpose in life. They look to comic books, um, like Batman and Robin was considered too violent for kids, and this is why the kids are acting out. Rock and roll music was way too sexually promiscuous. Think about like Elvis Presley. That was wild. I mean, girls screaming over a man, that was a little bit too much for the adults in the 50s. Elvis shaking his hips on TV. This is the whole story about Elvis Presley was just such a sex symbol that sometimes when they filmed him dancing, they would just film him from like the waist up because if he shook his hips too much, it just sent women into a sexual frenzy. Elvis is pretty good looking, young Elvis, though. I could see where they were going with that. But there is just a sense that there's a whole culture that emerges for young people, and adults just don't get it. And you can see that that's something that still seems to keep happening, where there's just all of a sudden this gulf emerges between youth and adults that never really seemed to exist before. People look towards for reasons for this. They look to the culture, they look to the music, the films, the comic books, um, and they're not really sure what else to blame for it because, again, if you're an adult in the 50s, you're glad for what you have. There is a lot of other, and so the 50s, they are very affluent. People are on the whole generally doing pretty well. Uh, Not to say that there aren't detractors and unhappy kids around, but it is a very affluent era. A lot of changes happen that make that a lot of changes because of the affluence as well. Um, and next time, the next lecture is going to talk about another section of the population that is going to be increasingly unhappy, and that is going to be African Americans, because while the 50s are very prosperous, they are going to be excluded from that prosperity, and that's going to really galvanize their attempts to win themselves more freedom and more equality and civil rights in the United States.